I want to introduce the man who has really been the driving force behind Outbreak Week to remind us to have these important conversations about preparedness for outbreaks, about what is the role of the media, about vaccines. And that man is Ashish Jha, who is the Dean for Global Strategy and the KT Lee Professor of Global Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, as well as the Director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. So with that, help me welcome Ashish Jha.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. That's very kind, thank you. So final day of Outbreak Week. For those of you who've been with us all week, it has been an incredible week. It takes a week to think through all the facets and all of the, actually it takes years, but we've tried to compress it in a week. Thinking about the historical perspectives, thinking about vaccines, thinking about media, and today we culminate with an action-packed day that I think is going to cover a broad set of topics. So why are we talking about the 1918 influenza pandemic? We believe the best estimates are that it killed between 30 and 50 million people. Probably the deadliest pandemic ever in the history of humanity. And it's killed 30 to 50 million people at a time when the world's population was about 1.5 billion. So just if you think about the impact on a population, it was massive. And so we have done this not by ourselves. We've had 10 partners within Harvard, none more engaged with us and more involved with us than the Petrie-Flom Center. So huge thanks to Petrie-Flom for all of their work on this. And then one of our outside partners, our main outside partner, has been the Smithsonian Institution. And so Sabrina Schultz, who I saw earlier, there she is, hi, right in front, which is why I missed her. And the Smithsonian has been a very important partner in all of this. And we'll come back to talking about the panels you see in the back. If you have not had a chance to go see Outbreak at the Smithsonian, you need to go do that. It's an extraordinary exhibit, really helped by some of the leading scientists in the world. So that has been an incredible event. Let me turn it over now to our keynote speaker, Tony Fauci, who in this room needs no introduction, but I will say only this. There have been many ways that I've heard Tony described. The way that has sort of, for me at least, captured what his role is in our country is Tony is America's scientist-in-chief. When it comes to issues of science, when it comes to the most pressing issues that we struggle with as a country, when we think about who is our leading scientist. Now, he's got official titles. He's the head of the NIAID. The Web of Science says he's the 11th most cited scholar ever out of 1.9 million scholars that they track. So all sorts of extraordinary accomplishments. But the way I think about it is in the middle of the most difficult moments where we really need to think about who is a scientist we trust, whose science is impeccable and yet whose voice really captures the mood of the country. There is nobody better. So when we were pulling this event together, the person who was at the top of our list for a keynote, of course, was Tony Fauci. And Dr. Fauci, we are so thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really very kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be with you here this morning. I'm sorry that I was unable to be earlier on, but there are other infectious diseases around. They don't occur necessarily in outbreaks, but I was at the UN General Assembly on tuberculosis for the past few days, which is sort of an interesting discussion that we'll have some other time. So what I want to do today is discuss the concept of pandemic preparedness. And by pandemic, I mean not necessarily just influenza, but all outbreak preparedness. And I'm dividing it up into three components that I will discuss relatively proportionately. As you see here from previous experiences, the multifactorial nature of how you prepare, and vaccine development, which is at the core of so much of our preparedness. So let's start off with previous experiences. So I'm going to take the liberty, I was discussing this with Mike Osterholm just a few minutes ago, of the fact that for better or for worse, I have been doing this for a really long period of time. In fact, I was appointed as the director of NIAID in 34 years ago. I was 11 years old at the time, and it was sort of a little bit unusual. It was got people shook up. But one of the things that one has to do in this position is be responsible to the administration, the Congress, and the American people in the arena of infectious diseases. So right about when I was appointed in 1984, I began a series of things that, I don't know if you'd say for better or for worse, but testifying before the Congress. And I'm going to give you a statistic that seems exaggerated, but it really isn't. But I'm telling it to you because it really underscores the importance of infectious diseases and outbreaks and how the country and the world is interested in it. I began testifying before the Congress in 1984, and I have the distinction, positive or negative, of having testified before Congress more than anyone else in history. And that's the truth. So, and the reason is, every time there's an outbreak, there's at least 10 congressional hearings. So if you say 10 times 34 years, you're talking about anywhere between 280 and 300 times testifying before the Congress. So the first time I did, I like maps. And I know I've shown this several times in the past, but I just want to, for those of you who have not seen this, I drew a map, or else my graphics guy drew a map of the United States, and the first time I testified was in 1984. And as you remember, that was the very early years of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So I put this on the map, and I said, there are outbreaks, and I'm going to come to you to predict for sure we'll continue to have outbreaks. And every year I testified before the Congress. The last time for our budget, just in the spring, I show the same map, but they never get tired of that map because every year I put either 1 or 2 or 3 new infectious diseases. The last time I did this, which was in April or May of this year, 2018, this is what the map looked like. Some of these are curiosities, little blips in the radar screen, and some of them are in great import. Obviously, HIV/AIDS is one of the most important of these, but there are others, such as the pandemic of 2009, such as the Ebola outbreak, and Zika, and chikungunya, and others. So rather than go through each and every one of these, I want to draw on the first part of the talk, previous experiences, and give you some lessons learned before we do a deep dive into how we respond, because there are different lessons with different outbreaks. There's some common denominators, but there's always a little bit different that you learn. So if you were to take some recent events in emerging infectious diseases, I don't have time to go into each and every one of these, but I want to pick out a few and just drop a couple of pearls about things that we need to remember. So the first one that we'll talk about is SARS, which is an amazing epidemiological phenomenon that we all need to remember in the history of how outbreaks occur. Of course, it has to do with everything from transparency, which, as you know, I see Mike smiling because we went through this together, is the outbreak in the Guangdong province of China, which was sort of sold in the early months to be kind of an unusual influenza. Well, it wasn't influenza. It was a brand new disease. In November, the first cases were seen in China. They reported the cases in February, so 3-4 months later, and only when one of the people who was infected went from Guangdong to Hong Kong and stayed in the now famous or infamous Metropole Hotel and infected about 19 people and did what most people who go to Hong Kong do, is they travel to other parts of the world. So 1, transparency, 2, geography, 3, transportation, because as soon as they got on the planes, what they did is that they created predictably a global pandemic. Now, that's the bad news. The somewhat encouraging news, another lesson, is don't, in our world of technology, sell short 19th and 20th century public health measures of identification, isolation, quarantine, because that actually, before we could do anything from a medical standpoint, essentially shut down the outbreak. Interestingly, we started and developed a vaccine for SARS. It tells you one lesson that I'm going to get back to over the next several minutes a few times. This was the first dipping our toe into the waters of 21st century technologies, of being able to sequence a virus and get it into a vaccine trial more quickly than you'd ever imagine. Namely, not necessarily having to grow a virus and activate it. And we did this with some DNA vaccine technology. It's interesting, we never had to use the vaccine, and no company was interested in taking it from us and making it into a vaccine. Understandably, because this was not economically sound for a company to do that. But as I mentioned, fortunately, and the lesson is that the outbreak essentially burned itself out with the help of typical, well-tried public health measures. Next, H1N1 pandemic, the first pandemic of the 21st century. Now, we all say, those of us who are involved in influenza, that the only thing predictable about influenza is that it's unpredictable. And as a matter of fact, the concept of unpredictability really showed itself because everybody was focusing on the Far East and China. Of course, that's where all the pandemics arise until they don't. So what happened back then? We had the pandemic of 2009. This was really an interesting experience for all of us, but for me it was a particularly interesting experience because what happened is that while we were looking towards China and the Far East, the outbreak actually occurred right in our own hemisphere. I have both California and Mexico down because the Californians say it started in Mexico, the Mexicans say it started in California. It's sort of kind of like the Spanish flu in Kansas or wherever. But as it turned out, it was there. Now, the interesting thing about this, why, I like it as an infectious disease person. I don't mean like to see these things happen, but it's such a fascinating phenomenon. As you all know, in influenza seasons, predictably, if there's one thing that's predictable in influenza, is that the season goes up, it peaks in January, February, it comes down in March. In March, we started to see a new virus. We all knew then that it actually was going to be a pandemic. It was brand new, and it was occurring at the end of the season. And the question was, would it spread? I began testifying before Congress saying, absolutely it will. And sure enough, the next month, in April, it was all over the world. And it wasn't the flu season in the Northern Hemisphere. It was April. So what did we do? And this was interesting. So this is a picture of Ann Schuchat, who was acting CDC director at the time, and I testifying before the United States Congress in April of 2009, saying we're pretty sure there's going to be a pandemic. And even though we have this antiquated way of needing to grow virus mostly in eggs, which takes about 6 or 7 months, we're on it. I wasn't so bold as to say we're on it. I was a little bit more modest, but I said, I think we can do this. So it's April, so 6 or 7 months. April, May, June, July, August, September, October. By October, we'll probably have the vaccine ready to go. We know that flu peaks in December, January, and February, so we'll probably get most people vaccinated before we have the peak of the epidemic. I was testifying before the Appropriations Committee. For those of you who follow things in Congress, that's the good committee. That's the committee that gives you money. You usually don't get into trouble with an Appropriations Committee. But then what happened? The children came back to school. And when they came back to school, we didn't have a peak in January and February. So this was the slide in blue of the influenza attack. And in red was the availability of the vaccine. And as I always say, what's wrong with this slide is that the blue line is where the red line should be, and the red line is where the blue line should be. Namely, by the time with all of the little mishaps that always happen when you have to grow a virus as opposed to the modern technologies we have, the epidemic peaked before we even had virus to distribute. So we did the tried and true way of responding, which is the reason why, as I know many of you know and are involved in this, why we're now very bullish on getting alternative ways to develop a flu vaccine. But I show this picture a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because when that happened, here now you see Tom Frieden and I and Jesse Goodman, not before the Appropriations Committee, but before the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, trying to explain to them why we knew about this 7 months ago, and we still had a situation where we were woefully behind in getting vaccine to the American public, which really triggered, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, something that we have been very, very much involved with, and that is trying to develop a universal influenza vaccine. We developed a strategic plan. We could talk about it during the question period, but it's something that I feel we really need committed to do. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be one single situation. It will be an iterative process that will ultimately get there. Okay, next is Ebola in West Africa. As you all know, Ebola was discovered in 1976. We've had 24 or so outbreaks over the years, ranging from anywhere from 2 or 3 people to a couple of hundred people, mostly in Central and Southern African countries. Then came the 2014-16 outbreak. Some lessons from previous experiences. One, transparency and ability to communicate. The first case was in December of 2013. It wasn't until March of 2014 that the world woke up and realized that we really have a problem here. And what happened, again, I don't need to tell the audience this story because it's well known. We had a catastrophic outbreak in 28,000 cases, 11,000 deaths, in what we call the perfect storm of infectious diseases. And every once in a while, you get a perfect storm, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Namely, something that generally would not happen unless you had multiple factors. 3 countries, porous borders, population totally distrustful of authority, and no healthcare delivery system. And that's what happened. What are some of the brighter sides of that, of lessons learned? And that is, you can do ethically sound and scientifically sound research in the setting of an outbreak, and you can learn things, and we did. Cliff Lane and my group started the Prevail in Liberia, the Partners for Research on Ebola Virus in Liberia, partnered with Musaka Fala, who's here in the audience, to doing some clinical trials in vaccines, in therapeutics, and long-term follow-up in survivor studies. We analyzed this, and the lesson we learned, published by the National Academy, was that you can actually do sound research in the setting of an outbreak. But I want to tell you something else of a lesson we learned is about the unrealistic fear sometimes we have with outbreaks in this country. And that was manifested when Ebola came here, when we had an individual, Mr. Duncan, who went from Monrovia to Dallas, was not aware that he was infected, though he was aware that he was exposed, went into an emergency room, left, came back days later, and exposed 2 nurses who in the first few days of taking care of him did not realize he had Ebola and were not completely protected with total body personal protective equipment. And what happened is that 2 of the nurses got infected, Amber Vincent and Nina Pham. And what happened is that all of a sudden, the attention of the United States turned from great concern about what was going on in West Africa to almost forgetting about West Africa and focusing on something that was not going to happen in the United States. We were not going to have a massive outbreak because that's not the way Ebola spreads. And in fact, USA said it very well, that fear spreads faster than Ebola, and that's for sure. But we learned something from that because in the United States, multiple years of training, certainly at the NIH, but also in Nebraska and Emory, of a special Ebola treatment facilities. We have been working on that for years, even before Ebola, because we were the area that would be taking care of people, particularly at Fort Detrick in Maryland, who might have accidentally gotten infected with something. So we needed a BSL-4 intensive care, and we did that. So we took care of Nina Pham, and here's a picture that was went viral. It was on the front page of the Washington Post of when we discharged Nina after taking care of her for about 2 weeks. And the reason I was very adamant about having a picture with my arm around her is that the other lesson you learned in Outbreak is stigma. Not only were people who were infected with Ebola stigmatized even though they got better, but the people who were taking care of Ebola were stigmatized. I don't like to say this, but it happened when we started taking care of Ebola patients at the NIH Clinical Center. The children of the nurses who were helping us were stigmatized against in daycare centers in the United States of America, right outside of Washington, D.C. One last thing about Ebola before I go on. We also then had a very interesting experience that has to do with the medical care of Ebola patients. One of Paul Farmer's physician's assistants from Sierra Leone got infected. Paul wanted the patient to be taken care of me and my team, so we arranged to air evac the person. And here's a picture of 3 members of my team getting ready to receive the patient on the back door of the NIH Clinical Center. And here we are bringing the patient up. And we had a system in the NIH Special Clinical Studies Unit, a 24-hour system in which you always have one infectious disease person and one intensive care person there with all the Watsons and the nurses getting ready to go. I did sort of a little mini sabbatical for about 4 weeks to join the team. I didn't want the people on my team to do this if I wasn't going to do it. So here we are. This is Dan Chertow and I getting ready. This is taken at 2:45 a.m., getting ready for our 2-hour shift. And this is Dan getting ready to go in to take care of this patient who will remain anonymous. And this essentially happens every 2 hours. So here I am putting my stuff on. I always give credit to this lady, this woman, this experienced nurse here behind me, and the individuals here who are checking us out. You can't have this type of an approach without a very experienced team who are responsible not only for the care of the patient, but for your safety. And here is Dan and I taking care of this patient that we reported in the Annals of Internal Medicine, who was one of the sickest patients I've ever seen in my life. But because of intensive care, Ebola is not 70, 80, 90% fatal. If you can maintain the person in a modern intensive care, the mortality is significantly lower. I can't say what it is, except that only one patient who was taken care of in the United States died, and that patient was dramatically ill even before they got into the intensive care. So it's much lower. And here again, I show the person was admitted, walked out of the hospital. I still see the patient in my clinic, comes in about every 6 months, doing very well. Moving on quickly, Zika in the Americas. We all know the story. It was discovered in 47, first patient in 52, 2 outbreaks in the Pacific Islands. We didn't pay much attention to it. Why? It was thought to be a trivial disease. 80% of the people had no symptoms. You go back here and you say, well, wait a minute. It was 2013 in French Polynesia. Why weren't you developing a vaccine then? Another area of a perfect storm. What happened is that when it finally got to Brazil, and the N was high, as shown by this green line, then we found out something we would not have predicted, that it wasn't inconsequential at all for pregnant women. And that's when we had the disaster of the microcephaly, which was really the tip of the iceberg, because there were many other things associated with this particular involvement of the central nervous system. So I'll stop there with previous experience. Let's move on quickly to how multifactorial pandemic preparedness is. And that's what we'll talk about. So here is some of the optimum preparedness factors. We obviously don't have time to go in through all of them. It's surveillance, laboratory capacity, communication, all the things we talk about. Since I'm from the NIH and I want to talk to you a little bit about the research response, let's just focus on that for a moment. The critical role of biomedical research in pandemic preparedness, you can break it down into three major components. First, the basic research portfolio. You can do research and you must be asking questions as outbreaks are evolving. You can't only do it in a postmortem, and that's exactly what we have been doing. We've done it with, when I say we, I mean the community, us. We do it with Ebola, we do it with Zika, we do it with chikungunya, we do it all. You can't do that unless you have some capacity, both domestic and international, and that's in fact what we do have. We have vaccine and treatment evaluation units in the United States. We have the Centers of Excellence for Influenza Research and Surveillance, CERS, globally throughout the world. And we have intramural international collaborations. So basic research portfolio, research capacity, and then the bottom line of it all is what do you do about it? And that is countermeasure development. The United States Public Health Service has that. It's called FEMC, the Public Health Emergency Countermeasures Enterprise, of which the NIH is one of many partners, including the CDC, the FDA, ASPR. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the NIH approach to this. As you all know, I'm sure, we do everything from basic to clinical research, research capacity, with the ultimate thought in mind of developing countermeasures. I have therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. But since we don't have a lot of time, let's just focus on the issue of vaccines. So vaccine development for pandemic preparedness, we've thought about it a lot. I've mentioned to you a concern that we all have about having to grow a particular pathogen, usually a virus, either inactivate it or attenuate it, make it a vaccine. It takes a lot of time. So all of us in the field have been figuring out how we can have the 21st century approach towards vaccine development to prepare for any outbreak, influenza or anything else. So I've divided that up into three components shown here on this slide. They overlap, they interdigitate, and they complement each other. The first is the issue of priority pathogens. Anticipate what might be something that likely would be an outbreak. That has some positive aspects to it and some negative aspects. If you're right, you're ahead of the game. If you're wrong, you may have wasted time. But there is a positive aspect to it. So the WHO has this R&D blueprint which aims to reduce the time between when you declare a public health emergency and you have a vaccine ready. So what they've done is that they've named a number of diseases to be urgently addressed under the R&D blueprint. This chart showing as of February 2018, and you see them listed there. This actually overlaps and is complements with a relatively new organization, Sept, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, which are working with a number of partners, including us, to develop vaccines against priority pathogens. And these are the first three of the priority pathogens that they have chosen: MERS, Nipah, and Lassa. Not a bad choice of three. But they're also doing something, and this is something that we at the NIH feel strongly should be the major direction of what we do, and that is to develop platforms, to perfect platforms that are easily interdigitated with whatever outbreak you have. So here are some of the vaccine platform technologies. And on the right is examples of diseases in which we've used them. So genetic immunizations, DNA and RNA vaccines, that you can see on the right, we started off with SARS and we went through. Viral vectors, recombinant proteins, nanoparticles will be key in developing a universal flu vaccine, for sure, as well as virus-like particles. Now, let me tell you why it's important to perfect a platform, because you get better and better at it, and the FDA gets more comfortable and more comfortable with it. So let me give you an example. As I mentioned, the first one we did was SARS, and you're all familiar with the DNA vaccine, probably going to be replaced by mRNA soon, but the DNA vaccine, where you stick a gene that encodes for the relevant protein into a plasmid, you inject it into an individual, they make viral-like particles. But this next slide is really interesting, because I mentioned to you that when we did this with SARS, at the time, back then, it was the quickest from sequence availability to a phase 1 trial. But each time we did it, it got better and better. It took 20 months from the time we got the sequence of SARS to put it into a first-in-human trial. We also did it with the H5N1 2005 pre-pandemic. We got it down to 11 months. We tried it again with H1N1, and from sequence to phase 1, it was 4 months. With Zika, we now have the indoor record, because from the time we sequenced Zika to get it into a trial, it was less than 4 months. And that trial is ongoing now in South America, accruing individuals, and we're getting a lot of safety and immunogenicity data, even though there aren't a lot of cases of Zika. And the FDA has been extremely cooperative and encouraging in this, that we might be able to actually get approval purely based on data from safety, immunogenicity, and bridging to animals. The final one is the prototype pathogen approach, something that has been pushed by a number of people, particularly Barney Graham in our vaccine research center at NIAID. And that is to pick out a particular genus like flavivirus and look at all of the pathogens that are in that group. Japanese encephalitis, West Nile virus, Zika, dengue, yellow fever, things that we've had to deal with. There are some commonalities there. And what we're doing now is we're trying to apply common denominator strategies and tools from experience with one virus to inform vaccine design for related viruses, so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every time we do something. So there's basic virology that has commonalities. Assays are similar. Animal models can be quite similar. Antigenic targets are similar. The platforms, if you have a DNA platform that works for West Nile, it's going to work for another one in that genus, for sure. I mean, you have to prove it always, but it is very unlikely that there's going to be major differences. The potential immune correlates are likely similar if you're making a response against a particular, in this case, a flavivirus, and the manufacturing is similar. So, in order to stay exactly on time, so let me close up with just a reiteration of what I've said. That pandemic preparedness is something, obviously, that we need to take very seriously. It's what we're all about in Outbreak Week. And there are things that we need to continually draw on. We continually learn from previous experience. Lessons learned are very important, and they are continual with every outbreak. We need to understand and utilize the multifactorial nature of pandemic preparedness. It's not unidimensional. It's not only science, it's not only surveillance, it's not only communication. It involves multiple agencies, public and private sector. And then vaccine development is critical, and that's the reason why we have to keep improving on it. And I'll end with a slide that I always end with, and it relates to something that many of us, as I look at my colleagues in the audience, have been talking about for some time, is What I used as the title here, Emerging Infections, a Perpetual Challenge, and it really is. If emerging infectious diseases are a perpetual challenge, then we as the responders need to be perpetually prepared and perpetually able to respond. Thank you.
So we have about 10, 15 minutes, I think, for questions.
Yes, of
and
course.
So people could come up here, and I'm going to ask the first, if that's okay, which is, my question is, I stole this from Mike Osterholm. It's about missiles, which is, we don't think a lot about the business model for missiles. There's a very specific business model, which is the government buys them, doesn't use them very often, but feels it's really important to have them for national security.
Right.
That's not how we think about vaccines for pandemics. The government, NIH, CDC, USAID, play very helpful roles in important parts of that process. But then we leave that last part up to the market, kind of, sort of, but we know that that doesn't quite work. So the question is, why don't we treat vaccines for pandemics the way we treat missiles, or should we, or is that a bad analogy?
No, it's a reasonable analogy, and it's something that we really have struggled with for years and years. I know, I'm certain that Mike tickled you with that because we've been discussing that for so long. There is a feeling, probably based on some reality, that the federal government is not a vaccine production organization. And the expertise of being able to do that and say we don't have to worry about a company getting involved, let's do that, is probably not feasible for keeping it warm and going. Having said that, I do believe that we should take a bit more responsibility in developing a vaccine without necessarily always relying on the pharmaceutical companies. We tiptoed into that a bit when we made hundreds of millions of dollars of investments to develop a plant in North Carolina to make the switch from egg-based to cell-based. You know, that was, I think, a good thing, but it wasn't enough in the sense of really trying to figure out how we might partner. Some pharmaceutical companies are actually approaching the government to figure out how they can be a source of a plant that's ready to go, in which you don't have opportunity costs lost, where you can actually go in and make a vaccine. So I think that the point you're making is reasonable. We shouldn't reject it, but there are a lot of potential obstacles in it, mostly costs, I think.
Okay. And while I wait for people to come up, and just if you come on up, were you going to say something on that, Kendall? Do you want to stand up there and just do the mic? And just as Kendall comes up, let me ask one other part of this, which is, again, I don't know much about the missile market, but we mostly leave it to private companies to make the missiles, and then the government buys them.
Right.
So the question is that a potentially right amount? And does it just come down to, does the government not want to get into buying? Because it's going to be expensive.
Yeah.
Or is there something else that holds us back?
No, I think it's not only the expense, but it's the realization that you can't buy a vaccine before something happens. You can get a factory that's ready to go and make it, so you don't have to be dealing with the companies. The question is, keeping that warm is the word they use, because if you just have the building there, it's immediately going to attrit, and it's not going to work. Right.
Kendall?
Right. So let's say we license a universal flu vaccine, and that's fantastic. So in your strategic vision, how are we going to pay for it? What's the model? Now, it's different from epidemic vaccines of other sorts where you may or may not need it. We know there will always be flu. But do you envision a semi-mandatory insurance-covered vaccine? Do you envision private markets, individual choice, or stockpiling it in reserve? Because it gets at this a little bit.
I envision that if we, again, let me just spend 30 seconds so that people don't get confused about what I mean by a universal flu vaccine. I don't think we're going to have a universal flu vaccine. I think it's going to take several years. I think we're going to go from a vaccine that covers all of H3N1, and then a vaccine that covers all of H1N1, and then aspirationally a vaccine that might cover all group 1 and then all group 2. But when we get to that point, I think a universal flu vaccine should be used the same way as we do with measles, the children. Essentially, it's part of the vaccine guidelines that you give. And the reason is a universal vaccine is going to be less beneficial for me than it is going to be for somebody who's 6 months, 1 year old. And that gets into the whole issue of imprinting and original antigenic sin. And if you want to imprint with somebody with an immune response, you want to do it as their first immune response. So I see it as the same way: measles, mumps, rubella, influenza, hepatitis, Haemophilus influenza B, et cetera, et cetera. That's how I see it happening. Right.
So it's simple. So there's a different problem for outbreak.
Right.
So I have a question about the role of dual-use research, developing super influenza viruses in developing vaccines. We interviewed Ron Fauci, who sort of is the guy who exploded some, or brought this to a lot of people's attention. And I accept that he's confident and his lab probably will protect us. The only problem, and any BSL-4 it has the ability, the only problem is that humans work in labs. And we know from anthrax that humans sometimes err even if all the systems are perfect. So could you just give a sense of the role of this kind of research in developing vaccines, and whether we've got the kind of, whether we actually can ever have controls which would protect us?
No, when you say I want to make sure that I'm answering the question that I think I'm hearing.
Yeah.
You know, when you mention Ron Fauci, you're talking about gain of function. Like what
Yeah.
role of gain of function? You know, there is, I mean, if you completely ban all gain of function research, then you're going to interfere with some of the important things we need to do. But there's some gain of function research that you really don't need to do. So I think that we have to, and we've struggled with it for years. It isn't perfect yet. To have some guidelines, and again, you can only control what the federal government funds. You can say we're not going to fund any research that puts the possibility of danger of an escaped microbe, only if you fund it, because you can't control what private industry is going to do unless you make a law to prevent them from doing that, which I think is not going to go a long way. Bottom line, I don't have a good answer for you, except that when we talk about those kind of experiments, as we've struggled with over the years, we try to create a culture of responsibility. And when, you know, culture of responsibility is as good as the people who are responsible. And we saw, as you said, with anthrax, that there are crazy people around who do crazy things. And I don't think we're ever going to get away from that, no matter what you do. So there's no good answer to it except to say to try and create a culture of responsibility when we do these things. Sorry, I couldn't give you a more precise answer. That's usually not the way I answer a question. Is kind of just the duration of the answer is disproportional to what you know about it.
So I guess the answer is we should still worry, but work even faster for universal flu vaccine, which even gets enhanced. Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
All right, well, while we wait to see if there's anybody else, I'm going to ask one more question. Sure. So yesterday we had a whole session on vaccines in the context of outbreaks. And one of the points that several people made was that vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations save lives. Right. That there is a difference between having a vaccine and all the work that goes in to getting people comfortable with the vaccine, taking the vaccine. You're often vaccinating healthy people. And that's a place where I feel like us on the public health side could be doing a better job on communicating and explaining. And so what advice do you have? How do we, because in some ways I feel like we're heading in the wrong direction on this. I mean, if you see the measles outbreaks happening in Europe, even in the US, that somehow we're losing this battle bit of explaining to our fellow citizens the value of all of this incredible science. Thoughts, advice about how we bridge that gap between vaccines and vaccinations?
Yeah, probably one of the most difficult problems that we face, you in the academic private sector and we in the government, particularly my CDC colleagues and I who deal with this all the time. The first thing is that you can't give up on trying to explain evidence-based information and try to appeal to people to understand the evidence. Now, the one thing we did learn, a couple of lessons, if you say, advice, this isn't advice, just a couple of things that I've learned, is that don't give up on trying to hammer out what evidence-based is and stay away from and try and debunk the things that are false. The trouble is, as we all know from the age of the internet, that once something is out there, it's out there, and it's very tough to bring it back. The other thing that I've learned is that there are a core group of people that no matter what you say or do will be anti-vaxxers. But there are an even larger group of people who I think if you don't insult them as being bad people and try and explain to them what the rationale for vaccination is and what the consequences are, as we have multiple examples. I mean, that's the data. Look at what has happened with the Senegal population in Minnesota. Look at what happened in Italy now. Italy is I think, going to be a really, I wouldn't say a good example because it isn't good, but it's going to be a very cogent example of what happens when at an institutional and government level you decrease vaccination, because Italy for sure is going to have major measles outbreaks. And that's what I think we need to articulate in a non-pejorative way to people. Look what happened there when you did anti-vax.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, I have a question about the communication with the population to avoid the fear. Because we've seen, for example, during the plague epidemic in Madagascar, that fear in the population led to a lot of people being worried about being infected, flooding the health infrastructure, which was already not that strong and causing problems, like the amount of samples that needed to be tested, and also in the setting where diagnostic tests are maybe not perfect, and figuring out who are really the cases. So I'm wondering, in terms of communication with the population where an epidemic is going on, so what's the best message to tell them? Like, if you think you're sick, go to a healthcare center. If you're sick, think about whether you've been exposed, like how to best.
Well, there are two issues there. What is the message and who delivers the message? So I think you need to get a message that's based on scientific evidence of what the best public health approach is, whatever that, depending on the disease, depending on the location. Should you go to a clinic? Should you do this? Should you do that? Get your message, but have the message be delivered by credible people in the community. We're seeing right now, we saw it a bit in West Africa, we're really seeing it now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo with the Ebola outbreak, that it is very, very difficult to get a population that's distrustful of authorities to come in and trying to do something. I mean, they burned down a hospital where we brought a person in with Ebola to try and get him to a treatment unit. So we need to get the general community that is relatively trusted by the populace to be able to deliver the message, but we need to decide on what the right public health message is. I always kid around, somewhat facetiously saying, you don't need a white guy in a suit like me going to a place that's totally not like me to deliver a message for people who have a distrust of people like me anyway. You have the people at the community level to do it.
Great. Maybe last question.
Hi, in an affluent country like the United States, where people are much more concerned about cancer, diabetes, heart disease, what do you do to convince people that they should be concerned about the threat of infectious disease? And, what would you say to someone to convince them that this is something that should be on their radar?
I think all you need to do is look at history and try and explain to them things that are real world history. It isn't only that in the United States, because what I try and do with and it isn't just me individually, but my colleagues, is to get people to appreciate that we live in a global community. And infectious diseases, as I'm telling an audience that knows this in spades, that is globality at its highest level. I mean, there's nothing that's not global about an infectious disease. And it isn't just worrying that what's over there may come here. That's one of it. But it has to do with everything from global economy to security to everything. That is really at the core of why we need to be concerned about infectious diseases. And we have to try and keep communicating in a way that people understand. But we have a lot of things in our favor because it isn't something that's just theoretical. I mean, it happens. We see it. We see the fear that happened with Ebola. We see what happens when you have the threat of a pandemic. We've had the worst seasonal flu. You know what came out yesterday from the CDC? 80,000 deaths. We've had more hospitalizations than we've ever had. We need to keep communicating that to people and showing examples of how that impacts people's lives, but also impacts the entire country. Having said that, it isn't easy because, as you said, you live in a rich country like the United States, and we often just have blinders of what's going on in other countries until we get a scare like we had with Ebola and Zika. Right.
Okay, Chris, as long as we make it quick, because we have.
I'll make it crisp. I noticed that in your charter at NIH, it includes allergies as well as infectious diseases. Is there a pandemic of allergies underway, and what, if anything, does it have to teach us about fighting epidemics?
Well, there's certainly more allergic type diseases that are going on right now for a variety of reasons. You know, when you talk about things like food allergies, that's clearly going up. There are a lot of theories about why that's the case. I don't think that there is, even though it is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the reason it was said that way because of the relationship between the immune response and infections historically, immunology grew out of infectious diseases. And I always joke with my co-institute directors that probably sooner or later every disease is going to turn out to be related to an infectious disease. Just kidding. I just want more money. I don't think it's comparable because allergies don't spread from person to person. I mean, that's the real difference, is the communicability of infectious diseases. So you wouldn't say you're having a pandemic of allergies, you're having an increase in the individual incidence of allergies, but pandemic, you think in terms of spread, either by vectors or by human to human. So that would be a tough analogy to make.